As soon as I get my mouse working here, I'm going to talk a little bit. I figured it's not going forward. Just played with this a while ago. No, I can't believe this. It's not going forward. I should just shut it down and start it up again. There it is. Okay. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about my career path to getting to the A-10. As Bill said, after graduating, I went to pilot training in beautiful Enid, Oklahoma, and we started off, I went backwards. I started off in the Cessna 172 for a couple of weeks, and that was pretty easy for me because my junior and senior year of college, the Air Force paid for me to get my private pilot license, and I flew that airplane. So that was pretty easy. So then we transitioned to our first jet, this little tiny Cessna T-37. They called it the Tweet because the engines made such a high-pitched, whiny noise. And you can see it side-by-side seating, and that way the instructor pilot could see if you were getting ready to hit the wrong switch, he could slap your hand. And then after that, we went to the T-38. It's a twin-engine, afterburner, supersonic airplane. It was quite a blast to fly. I remember my very first flight in it. I lit the afterburners, got shoved back in my seat. And before I know it, it's time to pull the stick back to lift off. And I remember the instructor pilot yelling, "Gear, gear, gear!" Because if I didn't get the gear up in time, it overspeeded and it would blow the gear doors off the gear. So in the very first flight, they take you up and they let you go supersonic, which is no big deal. I mean, you just see the Mach meter go through 1.0. You don't hear anything, you don't feel anything. So it's really not a big deal, and that was the last time I went supersonic because every other airplane I flew after that wasn't capable of supersonic speed. So after pilot training, I had to go to survival school up at Fairchild Air Force Base in Spokane, Washington. And we did some ground school, and then they sent our squad out into the woods with a canteen of water and said, we'll come back in 3 days and pick you up. So we were eating berries and digging up tubers and eating anything we could, but we survived. And then after that, they put us in a fake POW camp, like a North Vietnamese POW camp. And in there, they would smack the crap out of you and put you in an interrogation room and try to get you to talk. And you just give them name, rank, and serial number. Then they'd throw you in a little box about the size of a small refrigerator. You could barely move in there. And then they would blast music all night long so you couldn't sleep. And then they'd haul you out in the middle of the night, make you strip down, and they'd fire hose you with water out there in the cold, mountain air. And the only thing that made you survive that was that you knew this was our guys, this was Americans doing this to you, and they're just trying to train you. And you only had 3 more days to go through this. And then you thought about the guys in the Hanoi Hilton who'd been there for 6 and 7 years and what they were going through, and you said, man, this is nothing compared to what they're going through. And then after that school, I had to go down to Homestead Air Force Base in Florida and do water survival. You had to learn how to get out of your parachute once you got in the water, and the parachute was on top of you. You learn how to get in your raft. They had a cockpit simulated upside down in a pool of water, and you had to learn how to get out of that and swim up to the top, stuff like that. And while I was in pilot training, just before we got out of pilot training, they came down with a list of assignments of airplanes and bases, and you got to pick where you want to go. And I was number 1 in the class at the time, so I got to pick, and they had 1 A-7 aircraft coming down. And I picked that because that was also a pretty new airplane in the Air Force. It was a single seat, single engine. and it was state of the art. It had a heads-up display, inertial navigation system, computed bombing, radar bombing, terrain following, had a movable map display, and so this was going to be a pretty shit-hot airplane to fly. So I drove down to England Air Force Base, and I stopped at the guard gate, and I said, hey, I'm here to fly A-7s. And the guard said, we don't have any A-7s on this base, it's F-100s. And I looked down the street, sure enough, it's all F-100s. And I'm going, oh my God, they screwed up my assignment, what am I going to do? So I went to the squadron, and then they informed me that all the A-7s had been grounded because they had problems with an oil seal leaking in the engine, and the oil would leak out, and the engine would seize up, and pilots would have to punch out. So my school was going to be delayed until I got this problem fixed. And so now the guys are saying, well, it's myself, and there was another second lieutenant from another pilot training base. They're saying, well, we'll get these two brand new pilots on this base, and who knows when they're going to get to fly the A-7. We need to keep them, qualified or something. So the base happened to have a T-33 aircraft. So the base ops officer was a major. He was the one in charge of this airplane. So he gave us some manuals to read, and then he gave us a little ground school, talked about all the systems, and then he took us up for about 4 or 5 rides individually and checked us out in the airplane. So then when the other second lieutenant and I were all checked out, one day the major says to us, why don't you guys go up and fly? And we looked at each other and said, with who? And he goes, well, you guys go up together. And we're looking at each other, 2 second lieutenants going up together, well, who's going to be in charge? Well, the guy that sits in the front seat will be in charge. You guys take turns doing it. Okay, well, what do you want us to do? Do whatever you want to do. Go out and fly a low level, do some aerobatics, whatever. And then he says, well, when should we come back? We'll come back before you run out of gas. And in pilot training, everything was very strict in pilot training. You had to enter the pattern in a certain place on the ground. You had to turn base over the house with a big X painted on the top of it. And so when we're asked, said, well, where should we enter the pattern? Listen, you guys, see that on your wing? Those are wings. You guys can make your own decisions now. Just do what you need to do. And I tell you what, that was the greatest thing to build self-confidence for us 2 lieutenants to be able to go around and fire around this jet, do what we want. And on the weekends even, they would say, why don't you take the airplane and go someplace for the weekend? And we'd go, well, where? And he was, well, why don't you go to Nellis Air Force Base, spend the weekend in Vegas? Well, you don't have to ask us twice, But, so we did that for about 3 or 4 months until the A-7s were getting ready to come back online. But before we could go to the A-7 training, they sent us off to AT-33 training at Clovis Air Force Base. And that was basically the same airplane you just saw, but it had some hard points on the wings where they could put little practice bombs and they could put a gun pod on it. And so what they were going to do, they were going to train us how to, procedures in the bombing pattern and the strafing pattern, because the first ride of the A-7 was going to be solo because there were no 2-seat A-7s. So they wanted to teach us how to do some bombing. And basically, we learned how to do manual bombing. If you're going to drop a bomb, the Air Force has this great big manual that talks about every single bomb in the inventory, and you go through this manual and you look up, okay, I'm going to drop a 30-degree dive bomb, I'm going to release it at 3,000 feet, 350 knots, and it would give you a mill setting, and the mill setting is you cranked up in your little HUD right there, the thing called the pipper, and you could crank your mill setting for any type of bomb or any type of delivery you wanted to do. And you had to figure out for crosswinds, you had to aim, left and right so many feet per knot of crosswind. And if you're steep, the bomb is going to go long, so you pick early. If you're shallow, the bomb's going to go short, so you pick a lake. All these little things you had to kind of think about in your head as you're dropping manual bombs. And so finally off to A-7 training, and that was at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, Arizona. That was about 6 months. And but like I said before, the A-7 had computed bombing, and so you had all sorts of stuff in your heads-up display here, airspeed, altitude, your flight path marker, the pipper, you would designate what target you wanted to drop on, put the flight path marker over that line, the bomb fall line, and just pull up, and at the correct time the computer would drop the bomb. So bombing was very simple in the A-7. Of course, if your computer failed, then you had to go back to the old manual bombing again. That was a pain. Okay, So while I was in the A7 training, I called up attack headquarters and I volunteered to go to Vietnam. And they said, well, we've got a slot in a squadron in Thailand. The A7s are taking over the role of Sandy for the A1s. A1s were retiring. And the Sandy pilots were the ones that would go out if somebody was shot down, and they would search for them, and then they would go bring the Jolly Green helicopters in, escort them in, and then provide cover while they picked up the pilots. So that's what I was going to go off to Thailand for. But first, I had to go back to Inland Air Force Base, where they had a school to teach A7 pilots how to do this new search and rescue role. So I went back there for about 8 more weeks, and then after SAR school, finally off to Jungle Survival School, Clark Air Base in the Philippines. And that was kind of, they would give you classes on, how to try to survive in the jungle and stuff like that. And one thing they did, they were little natives of the Philippines are called negritos. They're about this tall, and they run around in the jungle with a loincloth and barefoot. And so they told our squad, they said, "Okay, you go out, we're going to give you a 2-hour head start. Go out and hide in the jungle, and then we're going to send this Negrito out to find you. And every one of you that he finds, he gets a bag of rice." So I went out there as far as I could. I found a nice gully, a bunch of down trees in it, and I got in there and I covered myself with dirt and leaves and branches and was waiting in there. And 5 minutes later, this guy comes and pulls me out of the hole, and he found every one of us, our squad, and they said he could smell you. He smells it. And so it's finally off to Karate Air Base, Thailand. There I am under the wing of an A7. And spent a little 19-tube rocket pod there. And you could set a switch before takeoff. You can set a switch to fire them singly, in pairs, or salvo mode, where they would come out about a tenth of a second apart. And this bomb here is a cluster bomb unit, the CBU, and it was a clamshell type. You could put a radar fuse on the top and the front of it, and you set it to go off at like 1,500 feet. And at 1,500 feet, the clamshell would open up, and 650 bombers with incendiary titanium pellets would come out and spin up in arms. They're about the size of a baseball, and when it hit the ground, all these pellets would just go flying all over the place. It was basically used for troops out in the open or soft-skinned targets like trucks and APCs. See, the harness I'm wearing is a parachute harness. The modern aircraft, the parachutes are built into the ejection seat itself. So you just go sit in there, and then you hook the straps from the parachute onto your harness. And I've got a survival vest on there. That had your .38 pistol. It had a couple of survival radios, a couple of spare batteries, has signaling flares, mirror, compass, stuff like that. And then the thing around my belly and down my legs there, that's a G-suit. A little tube hooks into the airplane. And as you pull G's, the bladders here, the stomach bladder, one around your thighs and one around your calf, they blow up and try to keep the blood from the lower part of your body up at the upper part of your body. Because as you're pulling G's, the more G's you pull, the blood comes out of your head and you start to get tunnel vision. And if you don't really grunt and strain and keep the blood up there, you can actually pass out. And when the F-16s came out in the Air Force, they were capable of pulling like almost an instantaneous 9 Gs. And so many guys were passing out and crashing that the Air Force ordered every fighter pilot to go through centrifuge training to learn how to really grunt and strain and pull 9 Gs. And that the centrifuge is where they, whip you around, this thing on the long arm, you're sitting in the capsule, and the faster it goes, and the more Gs you pull. And if you quit straining for just 1/2 of a second, you would black out. And when we blacked out, you would do what they call the funky chicken. You kind of go like this. And they had this all filmed, and so we always took the film back. Every time we had a squadron party, we would show the film of the guys doing the funky chicken. Okay, that's just another picture of an A7 there with some 750-pound bombs on it. So when I'm there in my squadron, after I get there, they told me, well, by the way, do you know the war ends next week? I go, what? All this training I've been through, and I volunteered to come over, and it's ending next week? Yep, it's ending August 15th, 1973. And I go, oh crap. They say, well, you can get a couple of missions in. So when the peace accords, the Paris Peace Accords were signed in January of 73, and then in February of 73, all the POWs were released. So we said, okay, we won't bomb in Vietnam anymore since you released our POWs. But we were still doing stuff in Cambodia and Laos because the Ho Chi Minh Trail was still active and bringing supplies and stuff. But they restricted everybody to stay above 10,000 feet because they didn't want anybody else shot down anymore, any more POWs. Because most of the airplanes that were shot down by small caliber AAA or people with automatic rifles. So if you were out there dropping bombs, you'd roll in from 20,000 feet, pickle the bomb about 14,000 and pull off to stay above 10,000 feet. The only time you could go below 10,000 feet is if there was an emergency situation, troops in contact, you needed to get in low and strafe, and you had to get the airborne command and control post. These are guys that fire on a C-130. When you go into a mission, you check in with these guys, tell them what ordnance you have, and they send you off to a FAC, forward air controller, to work a certain target. If this guy gave you his initials, that means you were authorized to go below 10,000 feet. So the day before the war ended, or that night before the war ended, everybody's in the officers club drinking some beers, and we got the ABCCC guys, the command post, the commanders guys, we kept feeding them beers and beers and say, give us your initials tomorrow, we want to straight, give us your initials, give us your initials. And so the last day of the war, we're flying into Cambodia, and we checked in with the guy, we dropped our bombs, and then we checked in again because we still had bullets, and he sent us to another FAC, and he gave us his initials. And we're going, all right. So we checked in with the FAC, and he's right over the top of Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia. And he says, I've got some Viet Cong on an island in the Mekong River, right in the heart of Phnom Penh. It's called Peanut Island. He said, I want you to strafe the northern end of that island. And so we're going, all right, we're authorized to strafe. So I'm following my leader. So we descend and we go down the Mekong River, and there's buildings on either side of us. Like we're getting real low and we're winding down the river, and I'm looking up at the buildings, and there's people looking out the window. There's people on the balconies just looking like this is nothing. You know, they've been at war for so long. It's like they've seen this all the time. And me, I'm just a young lieutenant scared shitless, you know, and going